I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. Got a great show for you today. We want to talk about a wide range of topics that are always current, sometimes so much so that we don't sit and think about the meaning of the key ideas, the key phrases that connect us and how we use to describe feelings, incidences, challenges, opportunities. Well, we'll take some time today discussing some topics and putting them in perspective, and you'll enjoy the conversation. Joining me today, Dr. Irma McClaurin, who is the Culture and Education editor for Inside News, a prolific author, writer, anthropologist, and the creator of the Irma McClaurin Black Feminist Archive at University of Massachusetts, Amherst. We'll talk about that in the course of the day. Also joining me, my friend and colleague, Jonathan Palmer, who is the executive director, CEO of Hallie Q. Brown Community Center in St. Paul, a prolific organizer and thought leader in our community. Jonathan, good to see you, my friend.
Great to see you as well. And good to see you, Dr. Irma.
Hey, good to see you too.
Well, let me do this. You know, what I wanted to do was just go straight to the basics. And we often among us talk about white supremacy or supremacy, but let's take some time to sit in on, supremacy, what we mean, what does it mean to us, what are we talking about, and how it shows up in our lived experience, in our cultural, historic experience, and as something that we have to either be aware of or on guard or fight against as we try to progress as human beings, as Black people. And so, Irma, let me start with you. When I say supremacy, when we say supremacy, what are we talking about?
We're really talking about power over, and we're talking about the sort of implicit assumption that some people feel that they're entitled to certain things, and therefore they have a right to them, and therefore, things should come automatically without them having to work or struggle for it. But it really is this idea of over, power over people, not power for or power to, but power over folks. And for me, that's what stands large. And I think we're at a moment where white supremacy is reasserting itself with the kind of vigor that we really have not seen since before the civil rights movement and enslavement.
Jonathan, what comes to your mind when you think about supremacy? What thoughts guide your analysis, your inspection of the question?
One, the erroneous belief that one group, specifically when we talk about it, it's white people, are better than all others, and that everything should be centered around them, everything should be focused on them, and the entitlement that Dr. Irma talked about that exists and centers right in the middle of that, such that systems work towards their betterment and work for their advantage, and that the whole of society is set up to be for them and for their benefit.
So where does it come from? How did the idea of supremacist thought emerge? What are the root causes? Irma?
Well, it began with the Enlightenment and probably before, but it is this idea that's rooted in what we call this philosophical notion and this idea of the great chain of beings. And in this idea, there's God, there's the angels, and then there are humans. But humans have a kind of there's a kind of priority. Whites are always at the top, and then people who are non-white. And the more you get away from being non-white, the lesser you are.
But
and so it is this.
How did that idea both announce itself and become the operating agenda for Western European society? I mean, are there particular things you can point to say this is where?
Yeah, I think part of it is class-based. It comes out of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and probably before, where people are really trying to figure out, before there was science, there was natural history. And people are trying to figure out, how is it that some people look different? Some societies are at different stages of development. And it's an evolutionist thing with European society and European development being at the apex, at the top, and everything else is measured in relation to that. And so there's this sense, even Marxism, is that you evolve from point A to point C, but they determine what point C is, and then everything else is measured in relationship to that. It's also trying to understand how is it some people acquire wealth, accumulate wealth, and pass it on, and other people don't. So you've got this tremendous, in Europe, you have this tremendous working class, underclass, poor people. And at this point, we're not even talking about slavery. We're talking about poor whites and people trying to figure out, how does that happen? How does that come about? And is there a natural order? That is the idea, social Darwinism, which Darwin, by the way, did not create. He was talking about, sort of natural phenomena. And then people take it and impose it, that there are some people who are naturally fit for leadership and others who are not. And so all of these things are sort of coming together into sort of philosophical kinds of beliefs that are also connected to biology, connecting it to, well, they must be less than because they look different. They must be less than because they're women and not men. They must be less than because. And so really trying to examine, these differences and put some kind of rationale to them.
Al, I want to go back to our good old friend, the transatlantic slave trade, and the emergence of white people from that. The idea of white as a race emerges out of that in the mid 1700s, because there's looking for a way to classify a difference. Prior to the transatlantic slave trade, there wasn't a global economy. There wasn't the idea of people moving about and being traded. Slavery did exist. That's one of the things that always comes up. Well, slavery existed in Egypt and African tribes. Yes, but slavery was not based upon race prior to the transatlantic slave trade. And slavery was a different kind of animal. In Africa, you would often end up a slave if you lost a war. Your tribe lost a war with another tribe, but you could still have your family. You could buy your way out of slavery. You could still own property. That all changes with the transatlantic slave trade. And as they're looking at that, the idea of white emerges as a way to distinguish from Europeans that are doing this thing and who they are capturing, and a way to go ahead and classify in such a way so that it justifies slavery and the supremacy. You come up with that, as Dr. Irma said, they're looking at this classification, who should lead, who should rule, and in order to go ahead and reconcile Christian beliefs with the actions that they're doing, in order to reconcile the notion of freedom with what they're doing to Africans and to other people of color across the world, they have to create this notion of white, and white is better than, and it's anointed by God, and this is the order that it should be in, so that it is okay for us to do this. These are not real people. You get the 3/5 clause that comes out of the Constitution. You get all of these pieces coming together that say, this is what's going to be above. And then that goes into systems that are set up to maintain that structure.
Right. And I think it's important to note that before the slave trade happens, you have Europeans, and the Portuguese were the beginning. I mean, they're back in the 14th century, sort of setting up trade and really sort of realizing that they're dealing with people who may look different, but these people have gold. They have kingdoms, they have organized themselves, and slowly it begins to evolve into them wanting to appropriate, wanting to take. And I think that is also at the root of supremacy, is this idea that, well, why should they have it? We need to have it. And then trying to figure out a way. So these things are evolving at different times, but they all sort of become complicit into one, understanding how is the human condition such that you have, remember, we're dealing with aristocracies and kings and them wanting to maintain their wealth. And in order to do that, because they don't work, they're just born into royalty. They don't work. So basically what they do is just to oppress the poor. They oppress farmers, they oppress, the people, and the people have to give up everything in order to have this lifestyle of privilege. Okay, that's where it begins, this lifestyle of privilege. Even in Africa, you have kings and you have royal kingdoms where the people are basically responsible, for making sure that that lifestyle persists. Now, you also have leadership that says, but this wealth has to be distributed in such a way that the people who are under my kingdom, will benefit, but we then will go and war against other kingdoms and we will kill those warriors and then we'll take, prisoners of women and children, and as Jonathan pointed out, sometimes under certain kingdoms, those people were actually able to become free after so many years of servitude. We see this in the warrior queen, right? That they're able to join or to prove themselves worthy, and then they cease to be slaves or enslaved in that sense. So it's a different kind of phenomenon.
Well, speaking of what we here call white supremacy, looking in the historical context, what would you say have been the historical both resistances and rejections of the notion of European or white supremacy? How does the notion of white supremacy play in Asia? How does it play in Africa? How does it play in South America? At the end of the day, it seems like it was a phenomenon that was unstoppable and that emerged as a global reality for most populations on the planet. Is that correct or not? Irma,
well, I think first we need to recognize that Europe, as we call it, is a continent with many different countries. Okay, and everybody. So the Portuguese are the first to actually begin trade and also to begin enslavement. The Dutch, the British come much later. Cecil Rhodes basically says, we celebrate the Rhodes Scholar, but his philosophy is to actually alleviate class conflict in England, go out and colonize somebody else. and it provides an opportunity for poor people who are lower class, to go into colonial service, exploiting someone else, and then elevate themselves by oppressing other people. So there are different ways. And so we shouldn't, because the French had a different way of colonization. They believed in assimilation. The more French you became, the better you were accepted. The Dutch were not assimilationists, and so they tried to keep people separate. The same with the British. So you get different forms in which this oppression begins to emerge. But it didn't always begin with, let's go in and enslave people. It began with trade. It began with really coveting what others had, because it turns out that Africa and Asia had all of these resources that, these European countries didn't have, and they wanted them, so it is really them coveting and wanting to figure out, how do we get the gold? How do we get the spices? How do we get, the things they have? Because we're white, we should have them, right? But it began with trade in that sense. And people weren't expecting this kind of reaction. They were unprepared for it.
And one of my favorite comedians, Eddie Izzard, has the joke about that England conquered the world with the convenient use of flags. Just showing up at a country. Do you have a flag? Nope. Okay, you're England's colony now. When you look at the colonization that happened, so I think you see supremacy grow in places where white people have had a stronghold. And where they have had colonization. So you see it in parts of Africa where there are colonies, but you don't see it as greatly, especially now, in parts of Asia, where the communities have taken over or taken back the countries that exist.
Look, Jonathan, and compare, if you would, India and China. You use that as a comparison, if you would.
And what you have there is a good kind of juxtaposition, because when you look at British rule in India, and that they were in charge. They took over the country, and then with them coming out, you get the partition. So even though the British leave, the idea is still there in terms of supremacy, and you get Pakistan coming out of that, and the segregation of people by religion, and being moved out and sectioned off based on those pieces. So you have the supremacy coming in, the colonization, but it doesn't last when you have numbers that are far in excess of what colonizers can bring. That doesn't mean the after effects aren't there for generations. I mean, you can look at some of the things that have been passed down that still stay as practices that sit. Cricket. I mean, that's one thing that's still, a lot of people from India, from Pakistan, from places like that still play that. You look at what's happened in China as China has become more and more on the forefront of world powers, and the release of colonization within that, which wasn't as large as it was in, say, India or other parts of Africa.
But we also cannot forget is that internally, there are already segmentations. There are already class differences, caste differences in India, right? And so what the British do is to appropriate that and basically, provide those who have privilege, even more privilege, the Rajasthanis, that, and Hindus become sort of the supreme, and everybody else is less than, which reinforces what is already in place. And when we look at people come here, we have to understand we're looking at certain kinds of castes. There's some people we never see and never will see in that sense because they're not of the right caste. Now, when they come here, if they don't speak the language or if their degrees don't transfer, it doesn't mean that they don't have elite understanding, The same thing in Latin America. Latin Americans may come here, they may not speak the language, but in their own home, they also have ways of segmenting people, and unfortunately, Black folks are always at the bottom. Everywhere in the world, we look and we begin to see. In China, you have the ethnics, you have ethnic Chinese who are treated much differently, than the Han. And so you begin to see these distinctions that then get played out. When people come to this country as immigrants, we have to understand they already have a level of oppression and stratification built into their own cultural systems. Then they come here and they incorporate the American stratification. So you've got like double layers of oppression and ideology that is operating in there, right?
And it depends on if they come to this country as a person of color or as a white person.
No, they didn't come here as people of color. That is an invented term that we invented to try and become more unified, believing that simply because someone, possessed melanin, but if their caste standing is such, they consider themselves to be elite, it has nothing to do with the melanin in their skin. People of color is an invented term. First, it was third world. It was a way of sort of us unifying people who were engaged in liberation struggle. Then it became, minorities, and they'll tell you, they're not minorities. And then we created this term called people of color, which I have no idea what it means, but it is a useless term because it assumes that because someone has some brown in their skin, that ideologically they see themselves as part of an oppressed class. That is not the case. That is not the case.
So that wasn't quite what I was talking about. And for me, people of color is that idea of melanin or belonging to these different groups. But what I was referring to was not their mindset, but what they encounter over here. So it doesn't matter how elite you think you are from another country. When you come over here and your skin is brown, you're going to run into some of the same systematic oppressions that people who were born here and grew up with those are. I'm talking about more this idea when we're talking about white supremacy.
And that may be true, but at the same time, people can find ways to distinguish and differentiate themselves from native-born oppressed people. And that is what they do. They become honorary whites. They see themselves as different from, so they may encounter some oppression, but class standing has a lot to do with it. Education has a lot to do with it. And if they then appropriate the oppression of the United States and then oppress people who don't look like them, who have more melanin in their skin, then they're part of the problem. They become complicit, regardless of whether they encounter it or not.
Let me step back again. So when did Africans colonize Europe? And part of the story that I hear from time to time is that this is the pendulum swing from the African presence in Europe that brought Europe out of the Dark Ages and into the Enlightenment. You described it. It was African knowledge, African education, African both astrology and architecture that elevated education, that elevated in Spain in particular, and from there spread out to more of Europe. And also
India. There's an African presence that is documented that dates back to the 15th century, in India. So
has the repression of Africanity been a consequence, a payback? There's an argument that did we do badly to those people, so much so that they now are doing badly to us, or is that a convenient dismissal of the reality of history?
There, at least as far as I know, and I've been thinking about Dr. Ganamado, who was, in Mobile from Benin, and there's clearly exchanges, and there may have been elements of oppression, but there is not the sort of global systematic, oppression that we see. It's more an exchange of ideas. People were treated, in that particular way. We don't have any evidence of Africans colonizing. Did they share information? Yes. Is Europe pissed off about that? Probably, because they like to believe that they were the first to invent everything. So part of it is, what was that exchange? Was it an exchange of equals or superior, meaning that Africans had already invented a mathematical, the oldest mathematical equations are documented in Africa, not in Europe. We know that the Aztecs, invented astronomy in certain ways, as well as Africa. And so are Europeans now wanting to rewrite history and see themselves as the center of everything? Of course.
I wouldn't even put that to now. I think that's been there for a number of years. But really what it goes back to is, it goes back to antiquity. Egypt was the center of learning in the ancient world. People came from all over the world to study in Egypt and carried the knowledge back to every place they go. Pythagoras, 22 years studying in Egypt. All his theorems and everything, that's all Egyptian. You go ahead to Plato, 12 years in Egypt, studied. And if you look at the myth of the cave, it is clearly an allegory for him bringing the knowledge back from Egypt into the Western world and having people, be against him because of that. So Africa was the center of learning. And then
not just Egypt, you have Ethiopia, you have all kinds of places where people are inventing and creating, architecture, as you say, processing of precious metals and stuff. The way in which Africans were able to process gold and turn it into sculptures and things, unprecedented in Europe, right?
But you also get the idea. So Ivan van Sertima wrote a great book called They Came Before Columbus, which tracks the travels and trades of Africans before Columbus, reaching out to the Americas and trading with the different colonies and the evidence that exists there. So I think what you get with a lot of indigenous tribes and people, Africans, Native Americans, other South Americans, is you get this idea of sharing the land, of sharing culture, sharing resources, rather than a take. The idea of having to possess that Dr. Irma was talking about earlier. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with monetary systems. As we start creating monetary systems, as people start figuring out this is worth something, then it becomes, I have to have it. The emergence of systems of marriage for contracts and the patriarchy comes out of the idea that men figured out they were involved in the birthing process. Before that, most societies were matriarchal. Women were the ones that were in charge because they were given as the creators. The moment that men figured out that they had something to do, that's when you start getting inheritance. That's when you start getting bride prices. And you get this whole negative system that comes out of I need, I want, I must have.
And also to diminish the power of women who give birth to everybody.
Yes.
Well,
And so,
let's pivot and talk about the question
Yeah.
of privilege altogether. And when you look at privilege, how it appeared both in antiquity and how it appears today. For example, privilege based on, we were just discussing color or race or place, but also privilege based on sex, sexual identification, privilege based on height, or class or caste. Let's look at this whole question of how privilege shows up.
Well, as far as I
community.
can track it, Al,
Go ahead.
it is with the rise of industrial agricultural society. People are mobile. Hunter and gatherers move about. And if there's conflict, they just separate off and form a different group. They don't go into war.
Mhm.
Once people become sedentary and we get the rise of agricultural development, that is when we began to see the emergence of caste. We have priests, we have people who are landowners, we have people who work the land, and suddenly we've got these stratifications that take place. And so the priests see themselves as the most privileged. They want people to pay them to just say, because they're the intermediaries between the people and the supreme beings, right? And so they're actually the cause of some of this because they're the first layer. Then you begin to get this notion of landowners and who should rule. And it becomes things where it becomes inherited, right? So you have siblings marrying each other in order to maintain the integrity, of that. It messes with the gene pool when you do that, right? But that's another story. But, people trying to say retain this idea of generational wealth. We talk about that now, but that begins with the aristocracy saying who is born to be a king versus who deserves to be a king or a leader or queen, right? And at that moment, then it's all male line because, as Jonathan points out, patriarchy has then said, just because women give birth to all of us doesn't mean that they're superior. And so there is this conscious way to repress. Think about it. The Virgin Mary is the epitome of the supreme power. She gives birth to, in the Judeo-Christian religion, the ultimate king of kings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet women are seen as less than in the church. And that is a way to appropriate power and to try and take away from that powerful phenomenon. Think about
Jonathan, what's the equation between patriarchy and violence? How does violence become a tool to both establish and maintain patriarchy, but also patriarchy as a symbolism of power? And Irma, what could and should and what might have matriarchal systems represented? Did they represent balance, a different approach to seeing the world that was not derived from exploitative power, but a sharing or a balance of some sort? Jonathan, what do you think?
I think definitely it goes back to one of the pieces Dr. Irma was talking about in terms of, people becoming sedentary. And when you start having things that you can describe as mine, and how you have to defend that instead of just sharing, this idea that emerges of possession. We talk about possessions 9/10 of the law. It's this idea of having, and it only belongs to you, and you want to keep from everybody else. With many of the earlier societies, there's free trade, there is sharing, there is community aspects. When you deal with an issue of mental health in Africa, it's the village comes together around that versus this individual's out there by themselves. So the more individualism that we have created as a sectioning off versus people emerging into what their independence, that's where it gets into this idea of this has to be mine. I have to keep it from you. You cannot have, and if you won't listen to me and back off, I will go ahead and strike at you. And that's where a lot of your religious tomes come into, is a way of keeping that violence and keeping that control in place, but the violence checked, because it comes out, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not bear false witness, all these things that are guides for people having good behavior.
And I think one of the things we can say is that every culture we know has a set of values. They have a sense of what is right, what is wrong, what is permissible, what is not permissible. It is in European societies that people begin and others codify laws, okay, which is a sort of an institutionalization of some of these things. And remember, when you're sedentary and you work that land, eventually you exhaust the land. And so what do you need to do? You need to expand. You need to go get some new land because you've exhausted the land that you've been using for after a while, certain crops will just rob the land of its value. And so people want to expand. They want to own lots of different things. As Jonathan pointed out, this notion of possession. When we began to look at encounters before colonialism, the sense of reciprocity, you have European beliefs around possession and ownership who are encountering people who believe in reciprocity. That if you have, think about the Trobriand Islanders that Malinowski wrote about. They had this sense of balance, of general reciprocity. Kings would have these ostentatious feasts where everybody would benefit. And then what they would do is that they didn't expect to get it back because it would circulate through the society. So it was a redistribution of wealth in a particular kind of way. Europeans come and they can't understand why you would do that. You're supposed to just keep it to yourself. So we have these different value systems that they're not able to articulate that are encountering each other. And the European value system, they say, well, look, can we have some of this land? And people think, well, sure, we're not using that land over there. They didn't realize that what the Europeans wanted was to own it and have it forever, And so sometimes these encounters are really lost in miscommunications and translations, and it begins to have, a serious repercussions on the cultures that come in contact with this.
Let's take a quick break and we'll come back. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane, my guest, Dr. Irma McClaurin and Jonathan Palmer. What a great conversation. We'll get deeper in a minute. Stay tuned. Are you or someone you know recovering financially from the COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdown, or any other reason? If so, help is available. Findhelp.org is a site to find a wide range of resources, including food, medical care, and more. The best part is based on your zip code. Visit findhelp.org, enter your zip code and the service you need. You'll get a map directing you to the organizations that can help you. Help is waiting at findhelp.org. If you need help starting anew, findhelp.org is the site for you. I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. What a wonderful conversation with my colleagues and my companions, Dr. Irma McClaurin, who's the education and culture editor for Insight News, an educator, an anthropologist, the founder of the Irma McClaurin Black Feminist Archive at University of Massachusetts Amherst, and one of the principals, the creating founder of the University Research, Outreach, and Engagement Center here at University of Minnesota. Also, Jonathan Palmer, who is the executive director and CEO at one of the legacy institutions in Twin Cities, Hallie Q. Brown Community Center in St. Paul. What a great conversation. And so let's continue with the general theme about privilege. That's kind of where I was trying to examine how privilege shows up and what the cultural implications are and what the individual implications are. So what does privilege look like for individuals in a community, in culture? And how do we tie this idea of understanding privilege to its broader, its macro impact? And to understand it that way, does that lead us to other ways of thinking? I don't know. I'm asking you. What do you think, Dr. Irma?
I would say that one, we have to understand that privilege operates on multiple levels. I used to say to a friend of mine, a white woman from Minneapolis, you have privilege. You're blonde. People are going to assume that you have certain kinds of skills or qualities just by looking at you. And she kept saying, but I'm poor. I'm not privileged. So some people associate privilege with wealth, with economic wealth, and that's a mistake. It is this sense of, as the little statement says, if you don't have to think about it. When I go to the store and I'm going to write a check, back in the day before you tapped your card, it used to be you had to think about how you were dressed, because if Black people came in and were to write a check, if they were in shorts and cutoffs, people wanted to see 5 kinds of ID. And I used to give this as a class assignment to my students. I would say, I want you to go to a space and I want you to just observe like the differences in how customers are treated. And one young woman went to a jewelry store in the mall, and she had her boyfriend, who was Black, come in. He's dressed in a suit and he says he wants to get an engagement ring for his girlfriend. And she's standing back observing. And so they show him the rings, but they never take it out of the case. She then sends in her surfer friend who is in cutoffs and flip-flops, and he says he wants to get an engagement ring. They take out the jewelry box and they show it to them. So who is more likely to buy this has nothing to do with it. The privilege this young surfer guy has is that he's white. They assume that he's going to be able to purchase this. And even if he doesn't, he gets to check the merchandise up close. Whereas the person who is dressed in such a way that he looks like he might be able to afford it doesn't get that privilege. And so privilege operates on multiple levels. At institutional levels, we know that people are more likely to hire someone who looks like them. And if the people doing the hiring are white, then it stands to reason that the people who get selected, whether they have all of the qualifications or not, have privilege. And those of us who've worked in those environments know that we have to jump through multiple hoops. We have to be twice as good, 10 times as good, in order to achieve the same recognition, of our talents. And so privilege is that unstated access. It's like the key. It is the access key that you don't have to show, because your skin is that key. And for men, it is their gender as well. So if you've got to choose between two, are you going to take a man or a woman? Historically had been, you take the man, because the assumption was, even if he doesn't have all the skills, he'll learn it faster because men are smarter than women. That was a built-in assumption. Now what's happening is that we've had a more balance where you have white women who have privilege. Unfortunately, they're now operating in the same space as white men. They've become gatekeepers. And so they are now committed to keeping people who look like me and Jonathan and you out, as opposed to letting us in. And occasionally 1 or 2 of us will get in. But when you look at the vast majority, we see a lot of people who get what we call on-the-job training. They don't have the skills. They're hired anyway. That's privilege, because they get to learn as they're working on this, whereas we have to come in already with all the skills and then some. So privilege are those unstated propositions, those unstated assumptions that someone has the capacity, even when they don't have the specifics.
I think it does also go to economics when you're talking about economic privilege. To your point earlier, when you talked about your favorite term, people of color, coming over here from other places but they're wealthy, and so that gives them some level. So depending upon the situation, I mean, the most prevalent, of course, is white privilege, and then I think gender privilege, male privilege. But we're also starting to see that in terms of orientation within the LGBTQIA plus community, and how people get into whose bathrooms should somebody use. We're seeing it more and more with the idea of disability and disability is coming to the forefront, and the privilege in being able to do things. The world, I think, since the murder of George Floyd, has reawoken to this idea. And the first focus is race, but it's also starting to look at other areas and see there is privilege around other things that happen that give you an advantage. Like you said, Dr. Irma, that unspoken thing that you're able to go ahead. Christian privilege. I mean, the whole idea of a war on Christmas, when it is the most prevalent holiday that goes throughout all of our country in the stores and the colors of cups, it gets into some of the most weird things that happen. People who have dominated a particular area by being part of a group, that's where their privilege comes in. That's where, if you use it responsibly, you can help elevate other groups. But if you don't, it becomes part of that oppressor class that goes ahead and takes advantage, that keeps women from getting to the jobs and getting fair pay.
Yes.
It keeps Black people from being able to live in a neighborhood or get a certain job, that keeps people who are disabled from being able to go freely in spaces and be able to partake of the same things that all of us do. So,
and when you have an intersection of those things, you
Yes.
know, which is what Kimberly Crenshaw talked about, is that if you only are trying to account for policy changes or changes that have to do with race, and you don't take into account that the person is also a woman or has a different sexual orientation and also may be disabled, right? Or, you know, then you're not really addressing all of it because you're only looking at one component. So some of us come with all of those aspects and they intersect. But also, let me just say, in the LGBTQIA community, there is also privilege. White gay men have more privilege because they're white, they're men. And even if they present as gay, they still come with a certain amount of privilege because of of their race. Okay. And also whether they chose to be out or in, right? Because some have amassed tremendous wealth as a result of functioning, you know, passing, as one of my colleagues says, he's writing a book called Passing for Almost Straight. They've passed for almost straight. They've amassed tremendous wealth. And within that LGBTQI community, there's also divisions there, that simply having sexual orientation similar does not necessarily discount issues of race or gender, you know, in that respect too. So we shouldn't forget that even within oppression, there's oppression.
And that reflects that multifaceted nature of privilege, and the idea that we're opening up to these ideas, but it is so much all at the same time that is happening that sometimes it's hard to sort out which piece we're working on and which piece is still affecting the group at that point. It's just important that we're being mindful of the idea, being mindful of privilege, and working around addressing the issues as best that we can.
I would say that when you find that you embody more of those intersections, that's where the fatigue comes in, because it's very difficult to function, you know, on an everyday basis. When a friend of mine, Dr. Cashel Scott, she has people do a push-up and says, okay, so if you're racialized, you know, do a push-up. If you have gender that has been oppressed, do a push-up. And then you see the people who don't have to do that, and they're standing back and saying, wow, you all are doing a lot of push-ups, right? And it begins to make people realize how physically exhausting it is when you embody so many of these intersections, you know? And so being mindful of them isn't enough. We actually have to be more explicit in terms of policy formation that looks at intersections that some people don't want to address.
And we've got to address that on the greatest level we can, but we also don't want to get so lost in the forest that we forget about the trees. People, you know, how people deal with things is always relative. How much we put in place and how much emphasis we put on it can affect the outcome, to a sense that we can end up doing the very thing that we're trying to fight against by overcorrecting. And so finding that sweet spot that is working on the issues, that is helping that is focusing on the cross that gets in there that Dr. Irma was talking about. We want to make sure that we're affecting it as many levels as we can.
And I think we also have to understand that when people have had privilege for so long and they begin to see that privilege being parceled out across many different people so they don't have as much of it as they want, we're getting a reaction. And I think we're in that moment now. I think this sense of trying to rewrite history to say slavery was a good thing and that you folks benefited from it, not to mention us folks, white folks benefited from it.
Right.
That's we're in that moment where people are trying to reclaim what I call reclaim whiteness or reclaim white supremacy and white privilege. They're saying, well, wait a minute, I think I've given up too much, in trying to, as you say, to compensate and to the idea of equity and equal. So when you have privilege, you want everything equal. That means everybody gets the same. So if I'm 5'2" and the table is 6 feet, it doesn't work for me, but it may work for other people. Equitable means you adjust the table or you give me a stool to stand on. And that means I'm going to have something different from you. People with privilege don't want that. And that's what we're beginning to see is people trying to rewrite history, banning books, trying to formulate things in such a way where their privilege is assured and is stabilized and is passed on to their children, as opposed to sharing it across the board.
So, Irma, before you go, Jonathan, I keep coming into thinking of you as the creator of the Black Feminist Archive, number one, and the reason for the creation of a feminist archive, Black Feminist Archive. And it goes back to my original question, and that is about, is there a solution in historical matriarchal systems that is different from what we've decided and described as the patriarchy? And I think we said that I have anyway, associated the violence with patriarchy, but it may be associated with matriarchal systems as well. But the question is, how do can we find a way to achieve balance, to achieve something different, a different lens or structure or process that comes out of the acknowledgement of women as the source of creation? Does it,
Well, I think the question you're asking is, are women inherently more peaceful than men? Are they, because they give birth, more inclined? Well, not everybody has a nurturing spirit, right? But everything that we learn, people are not naturally born violent necessarily. There may be some people who have some kind of genetic dysfunction where their ability to empathize or have compassion has somehow been, turned off. But we all have the capacity for that. We are socialized. And I think women as well as men have to look at how we socialize. How do we socialize girls versus boys? How do we socialize people who began to manifest a difference in their orientation that is different from the biology, the body in which they were born, right? How do we accept that? So now there are debates about, is it too soon? Is that, should someone who's like 9 or 10 be able to say, well, I'm trans, or, I feel like I have the body of a boy, but I actually feel like I'm a girl, or I feel feminine, or whatever these terms may be. And I think we're trying to come to terms with that. We have ideas about at what point does one's biological or social identity manifest itself. We have put it at adolescence, right? But in other societies, people actually see development and adulthood at different ages than what we in the West and we in your sort of Europeanized societies see, And so there's some real questions out there. At what point, Margaret Mead raised this, is this nature or nurture? At what point is it nature and at what point is it nurture? And what some would argue is that they both start so early in life. how we let boy babies cry more because we want to toughen them up, right? How we treat even infants begins to condition people towards what direction they move in. So to answer your question, I think we have to look at our socialization. How do we treat people from the time that they are born? Certainly giving birth for some people creates a level of compassion, but there are women who hate being mothers. There are women who do not want to nurture their children.
Mhm.
And so I think, rather than say that women are innately more, let's say that because of the social roles we've played, we have had more experience at negotiating and navigating conflict because we are generally in the domestic space with children,
Mhm.
and or also responsible for seniors because
Mhm.
women tend to get
Mhm.
put with that relationship as
Yeah.
well. And so we've had more at compromise and trying to find non-conflictual ways of navigating these spaces. We need to find more ways, and I think we began to see that with parent leave is more men involved in child care or child rearing. More there are men starting to stay at home and letting their wives be the person who becomes the breadwinner. And I think the more that we make these kinds of adjustments where we see differences and possibilities, then I think we can move in a direction away from conflict. But if people want privilege, they will do it by any means necessary. And I think that's the moment we're in now. And it doesn't matter what their gender is, because some of the most strongest advocates of privilege at this moment are women.
Mhm. Mhm.
Not men.
Mhm.
It's women who are
Mhm.
saying the most egregious kinds of things in terms of what should be happening or not,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Let's look at the right to life movement, which historically has been women, but I've seen tons of men protesting some of the places that offer information about abortion.
Mhm.
These people are determined to make sure that women keep their children, and yet they have nothing to do with the foster care system.
Mhm.
They're not advocating for more money to go into that. If people
Mhm.
decide that, yes, I will have the child, but I don't want to rear that child, they're not doing anything. So they care about this whole notion of procreation and at what point does life begin. But once that child is born, these people do nothing financially or politically or socially to make sure that we have a foster care system that takes care of these children.
It's an inconsistent ethic of life. They're
Absolutely.
very much there talking about birth, and they're going to make a decision for a woman about what happens with her body and
Yes.
what happens with her life. But as you said, they don't have any care for supporting the systems that that woman will need to go through the rest of her life, or holding accountable the man
That's
that was
right.
involved in that, especially when you get into some of these more extreme cases that they've talked about, from rape or incest or things like that. It is funny ironic to see how the pendulum swings back and forth. And you go
Mhm.
back into earlier antiquity, you had women as warriors, you had women as leaders, you had women doing all the things that men do, and sometimes more than men do. And then we got into this mid-America, good old-fashioned housewife, whatever you want to call it. And now you're starting to see more of that emerging in terms of the
Yes.
leadership. But what you're also seeing is, like Dr. Irma said, they're also in the places that are problematic, in these movements that are going ahead and taking away people's rights. And the intersection you see there in between religious ideologies, in between political affiliation, is very indicative of which groups are focused on that versus the overall idea of what a concept is and how it works. We
So
get in.
we're so we're
Go ahead.
we're about a year out from the big election, right? So what does it mean? What do we have to be thinking about in terms of mobilizing voters? And what are the challenges? We have, I think, to educate ourselves about this notion of voter disenfranchisement. What is that, and how does it show up? Lots of times, people, that's the old idea of somebody telling you, don't trust your lying eyes, right? they're doing stuff to you and telling you they're not, but the consequence is you get discouraged and are unable to exercise your power, your right to vote. What does and how does that show up, and how does it sort of lead to the next step in this discussion we're having about power?
The greatest enemy of that, I think, is ignorant people. And I'm not trying to be facetious. I mean, people who don't know things, people who have picked up a soundbite, people who have heard something from a friend and don't actually investigate, don't actually take a look at what the impact will be on electing a person, on voting for a law, of going ahead and looking at the actual impact that something will have. You've had this whole big piece in schools where they're yelling about, we're not going to have them teach critical race theory at our school. And Florida's gone all way over there. And it's like, they're not teaching critical race theory in school. You're right. They're not going to do it. You can protest all you want. They're still not going to do it because it's a graduate level framework. So they can't teach it to a fourth grader, but you want to go ahead and get mad. And what they really mean when they say that, they mean history. Black history, history of BIPOC people, other groups about that.
History in which white is not superior.
Yes.
A history, and that is the history that they want to keep us to, and what, Black people have never counted on schools that are predominantly run and administered by whites to tell the truth about us. We've always had Black newspapers, from, David Walker's Appeal to Frederick Douglass's North Star since the 1800s. So we've always had alternative ways. And that's why my archive is so important, because it is primary material that you can go directly to the source. But what we are going to end up with is a lot of stupid white people who will say, well, I didn't know. And they didn't know because people banned the books. You've got students burning books. What kind of sense does that make? And what parent allows their child to burn a book? And so I think we have to understand that we're moving to a moment almost pre-1950s where whites sort of cordoned themselves off intellectually and socially. And they lived in this white universe, the Disney version of the real world.
Yeah,
and in that version of the world, they don't want to know. And not knowing, as if somehow not knowing is not a choice.
That
Being
is
ignorant is a choice.
That is so typified in one of my favorite movies, Pleasantville. It's a story about a guy who really likes the old-timey, like, kind of Mayberry type of show, and gets sucked into the show with his sister, and everything's in black and white. But then his sister starts introducing ideas, and as she does, things start to have color in the world. And it sets up this whole dynamic of enlightenment color coming with enlightenment, and black and white 1950s being in that segmented off place. And Dr. Irma raised a really good point. She's got an archive. We have an archive here at Hallie Key Brown.
Yes.
And that's part of the most important thing, is preserving the history so that it is told the real way and people can see we've been through this before. We're ready.
And we have to understand that historians and documentarians, like I call the Ken Burns version of the world, they go to archives to get their materials. If we're not in it, then we don't exist.
Guys, we're out of time. What a wonderful conversation, but it always goes so quickly. I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. My guest, Dr. Irma McClaurin, Jonathan Palmer. We'll see you next time.